In May 2026, a judge of the Federal Court handed down the largest native title compensation award in Australian history, about $150 million, against a company called Fortescue. So let's be clear straight away, because this is not a story about that empire collapsing. It hasn't. Last year, Fortescue shipped more iron ore than in any year of its existence. The word fall in the title of this film is doing something else entirely. This family arrived in Western Australia in 1842 with nothing. One of their 10 children became the first premier of the state. Another opened the Kimberley. A third took a sheep station on the Ashburton River. And in 1998, the Forrests lost it. The man who bought it back is Andrew Forrest, and the court found 124 sacred sites destroyed on ground that was never his. Before we go any further, if you want to keep these stories alive, I've created a book with the complete Australian lost factories. The workers, the gates, the Australian maid, all gone. The link is on the first line of the description. Back to the story. A note before we begin. This story is told on Thalanagy, Yindjibarndi and Kimberley country, and it contains the names and images of Aboriginal people who have died. It also contains a court's findings about the destruction of sacred sites. Chapter 1. The Mill at Picton. William Forrest was the son of a Scottish lawyer from Stonehaven in Kincardineshire on the northeast coast. He and his wife Margaret, whose maiden name was Hill, sailed for the Swan River colony and arrived in 1842, indentured to work for a doctor named John Ferguson. The ship was called the Trusty. What they built was a flour mill on the Preston River at Picton, near Bunbury, in the far southwest corner of Western Australia. Hold that geography, because it matters for the whole rest of this film. Bunbury is south of Perth. Almost everything else in this story happens 2,000 kilometres to the north, in country that in 1842 no European had crossed. They had 10 children. Now a correction, and it belongs here rather than anywhere else, because it is the first thing almost everybody gets wrong about this family. You will be told that Sir John Forrest was the eldest of those 10. There is an official Western Australian tourism video that says exactly that. He was not. The first child was a daughter, Mary, born in Glasgow in 1841, who died as an infant before the family ever sailed. Then came William, born at sea aboard the Trusty on the voyage out, then James, and then John. The fourth child, and the third surviving son, the people who pointed this out did it in public, underneath that video, and they are descendants of the family. They listed every sibling in order. They are right, and the Australian Dictionary of Biography agrees with them. One flag while we are here. The exact birth and death years for the younger brothers, Robert, Matthew and Augustus, come from family genealogists rather than from the biographical record, so this film is attributing them rather than asserting them. And there is a second thing everybody gets wrong, which is how the modern Forrests connect to the old ones. Andrew Forrest is not descended from Sir John. He is descended from the sixth child, David. David was his great-grandfather. John and Alexander are his great-great-uncles. The line runs David, then Mervyn, then Donald, then Andrew. It is worth pausing on what that family actually was in 1842, because the distance travelled here is enormous. William Forrest was not a gentleman settler with capital. He arrived under indenture, which means his labour was owed to another man before he set foot on the ground. And he worked it off milling flour on a river in the southwest. And in 1863, the fourth son was apprenticed to a surveyor. Chapter 2. The Baron Who Never Was. John Forrest was born at Picton, near Bunbury, on the 22nd of August, 1847. He joined the survey department at the end of 1865, and by 22 he was leading expeditions into country no European had entered. There were 3 that made his name. In 1869, he went looking for what was left of Ludwig Leichhardt, the German naturalist who had walked into the interior 21 years earlier with a party of 7 and was never seen again. Forrest did not find him. Nobody ever has. In 1870, he crossed from Perth to Adelaide along the edge of the Great Australian Bight, and in 1874 he crossed from Geraldton on the mid-west coast all the way to the overland telegraph line in Central Australia, through the desert, with horses, on a route nobody had mapped. His younger brother Alexander was beside him on both crossings. The Royal Geographical Society gave him its Patrons Medal in 1876. Then he stopped exploring and started governing. Surveyor General in 1883. And on the 22nd of December, 1890, John Forrest became the first Premier of Western Australia. He was the Premier who backed C.Y. O'Connor's pipeline to the goldfields, and that is a story this channel has already told. So it gets one sentence here and no more. At Federation, he went to the National Parliament, and this is the part of his career that gets forgotten. He became the first Australian-born member of a federal cabinet. He was Treasurer of the Commonwealth in 5 separate ministries. He was acting Prime Minister in 1907. And he came within a single vote of the Prime Ministership itself. Then, in February 1918, the King approved his elevation to the peerage, Baron Forrest of Bunbury, the first Australian ever raised to the British peerage in his own right. Here is what actually happened next. He was dying. There was a cancerous growth on his temple, and he had already been operated on. He resigned as Treasurer in March, and in July 1918 he sailed from Albany aboard a troop ship called the Marathon, with his wife Margaret and a nurse, bound for London for surgery and for his seat in the House of Lords. He turned 71 at sea. He never got there. He died on the 2nd of September 1918, with the ship off the coast of Sierra Leone. And here is the legal position, which is stranger than the story usually told. The letters patent were never issued. The title was never formalised. It does not appear in the peerage records. And he died without a son, so even if it had been completed, it would have lapsed with him. There was never, strictly speaking, a Lord Forrest. One flag, some sources give his death as the 3rd of September. Australian records say the 2nd. His body was brought home and buried at Karrakatta. Consider what that career actually is. A boy from a flour mill in a colony of a few thousand people walked into the desert at 22, came out with a reputation, and finished as the man who held the national purse. In 50 years he went from surveying a continent nobody had mapped to signing the budgets of a country that did not exist when he was born. And his younger brother had already opened a third of the state. Chapter 3. 25 million acres. Alexander Forrest was born in September 1849, the 5th child. He had been second in command on both of his brother's great crossings, which meant that by the age of 30, he had probably seen more of Western Australia than any other European alive. In February 1879, he set out on his own. 8 men went from the De Grey River in the Pilbara, northeast across country nobody had surveyed, aiming for the overland telegraph. His brother Matthew went with him. What he found was a river system running through good grass. He named the Ord River after the governor. He named the Margaret River after the woman his brother John would later marry, and that is a Kimberley River, not the wine district 2,000 kilometres south that shares the name. And the district he had crossed became known as the Kimberley. In his journal, in October 1879, he set down the number that this chapter is named for. About 25 million acres, he wrote, has been opened up for pastoral and agricultural experiments. Now, here is what he did next, and it is the part that matters. Survey officers were not supposed to profit from the country they found. Alexander Forrest went into business as a land agent. When the Kimberley leases were offered in October 1880, applications came in for more than 20 million hectares inside 3 years, and the man handling a great many of those applications was the man who had drawn the map. One of the people he personally briefed was an Irish cattleman from Queensland named Patsy Durack. This channel has told that story, the 2-year walk across the continent, 7,000 cattle, half of them dead on the road. What that film did not say is why the Duracks went at all. They went because Alexander Forrest told them to. And what came behind the leases is documented, and this film is not going to soften it. Through the 1880s and 1890s, the Kimberley became one of the most violent frontiers in the country. Dispossession, punitive expeditions, killings recorded in police files and in newspapers, and much later, counted by historians. There is an honest complication in Alexander's own journal, and it is worth stating. He recorded Aboriginal people along his route who showed no hostility to him at all. What arrived after him did. He became the first member for Kimberley in the colonial parliament and twice Mayor of Perth. He died on the 20th of June, 1901, of kidney disease, and his estate was sworn at £195,000, one of the largest Western Australia had seen. And there is a symmetry here that runs right through this film. Alexander Forrest made his money by knowing where the good country was before anybody else did, and then selling that knowledge to the men who wanted it. A century later, a descendant would build the largest fortune in the state's history on very nearly the same principle. And 5 weeks before he died, the Boer War killed his son. Chapter 4. Minderoo. Minderoo sits on the Ashburton River, about 40 kilometres south of Onslow, on the southwestern edge of the Pilbara. Roughly 2,400 square kilometres, with something like 80 kilometres of river frontage running through it. In that country, river frontage is the whole asset. It is Thalaniji country, and the name is theirs. Minderoo is a Thalaniji word, and it means place of permanent and clean water. The river itself in that language is Minderoo, and the ancestral being that lives in it is a water serpent. Consider what that means. The name on the Forrest family's foundation, the name on nearly $5 billion of Australian philanthropy, is an Aboriginal word, and what it describes is water. How the family got it is straightforward enough on paper. The lease was first formed in 1867 by a man named Hooley. In 1874, David Forrest drove a mob of sheep onto it, held with his brothers John and Alexander and a partner named Septimus Burt. The station dates from about 1878. One flag, some sources say 1879. And now the part the family history does not lead with. The heritage record for that station documents that its early years included punitive expeditions. After a shepherd was found dead in 1869, 2 of them followed. A Perth newspaper in 1918 referred in passing to something it called the Battle of Minderoo. Label that honestly. Some of it is newspaper language and station memory rather than court record, and this film is calling it that. What is not in doubt is that the station ran on Aboriginal labour, and that its establishment was not peaceful, and that neither of those things was unusual anywhere in the Australian north. $150 million is what a court decided in 2026 that taking country from its owners is worth. Nobody has ever put a figure on this one. Nobody ever will. There is one more thing about that country worth understanding, because it explains why a sheep station on the Ashburton could produce what it produced. The Pilbara is not farmland. It is one of the oldest exposed landscapes on the planet, iron-stained rock over spinifex, where the rain arrives in cyclones or does not arrive at all. A pastoral run there is not a farm. It is a very large bet on water. The station passed down. David to Mervyn, Mervyn to Donald, and Donald to a boy doing his lessons over a shortwave radio, and the reason Mervyn inherited it at all is a grave in Egypt. Chapter 5. The Wars. Start with the Boer War, because it comes first and because almost nobody knows it. Lieutenant Anthony Alexander Forrest was Alexander's son. He was 16 years old. He served with the 5th Western Australian Mounted Infantry, and he was killed near Carolina, in the Transvaal, on the 15th of May, 1901. He was Sir John Forrest's nephew, and he is commemorated at the Australian War Memorial. One flag, a memorial plaque, gives the date as the 16th. His father died 5 weeks later. Be careful with that. The cause recorded for Alexander Forrest is kidney disease, and he had been ill. This film is not going to tell you that a man died of grief. It is going to tell you that those two things happened 5 weeks apart, in the same year, in the same family, and let you sit with it. Now, the First World War, and this is the hinge of the entire dynasty. Lance Corporal Donald Lewis Forrest was born at Claremont in November 1893, a son of David Forrest of Minderoo. He enlisted. He was sent to Egypt, and he died on the 1st of July 1915 at Ismailia on the Suez Canal, not in the trenches, of pneumonia before he ever reached them. His death left his brother Mervyn as David's only surviving son, and therefore sole heir to Minderoo. Sit with the arithmetic of that. Without a young man dying of an illness in a camp in Egypt in 1915, there is no Mervyn on that station, no Donald after him, no boy on the School of the Air 40 years later. The largest private fortune built in Western Australia in the last quarter century runs back through a casualty list. Sir John Forrest spent that war as Commonwealth Treasurer, framing the budgets that paid for it. His last act in the office was to authorise the payment of money for the raising of the Australian Imperial Force. And now the Second World War, and this film is going to be straight with you about it. The Forrests left almost no direct record of it. The men of the line were the wrong ages. Donald Forrest, Andrew's father, was born in 1928 and was a child throughout. There is no documented Forrest service, and this film is not going to invent one to fill a chapter. What is true is that the war came to their country anyway. Port Hedland was bombed in July 1942. Onslow, the town nearest Minderoo, was bombed in 1943. Women and children were moved south. And one more thing from that decade shaped everything that follows. In 1938, the Commonwealth banned the export of iron ore from Australia, and did not lift it until 1960. This channel has told that story in full. What matters here is only what it left behind. 22 years in which the Pilbara sat there, mapped by nobody, wanted by nobody, worth nothing. There is one more reason that decade matters. The Aboriginal stockmen who ran the northern stations were, across most of that industry, paid in rations rather than wages, and would be until the late 1960s. Minderoo was a station in the north. Whatever else the family built, it was built on that arrangement, and in 1998 the family lost the station. Chapter 6. 1998. Andrew Forrest was born in Perth on the 18th of November, 1961, the youngest of 3 children of Donald and Judith Forrest. He was raised at Minderoo, doing his primary schooling over a shortwave radio on the School of the Air, before being sent south to Christchurch Grammar and then Hale. He had a serious stutter as a child and has spoken about it publicly for years. He learned to box, then economics at the University of Western Australia, and a career as a stockbroker in Perth. And in the 1990s he founded his first mining company. It was called Anaconda Nickel, and it was going to build a nickel and cobalt plant at Murrin in the northern goldfields of Western Australia. Note the geography because it is nowhere near the Pilbara. Murrin is inland, east of Kalgoorlie, in completely different country. He raised the better part of $1 billion on a leaching technology that had never been proven at that scale. The plant did not work as designed. The clays clogged it. The acid corroded it. The contractor later paid the joint venture more than $150 million in settlements. Andrew Forrest was removed as chief executive in 2001. Say it the way the ABC said it, years afterwards. A lot of people lost money as a result of that, and it really tarnished his reputation. And while that was falling apart, on the other side of the state, his father was losing Minderoo, drought and debt, and a run of bad years. In 1998, after about 120 years in the family, Donald Forrest sold the station. And in June of that same year, Andrew and Nicola Forrest's third daughter, Matilda, was stillborn. Everything this film says about that comes from what the family themselves have said publicly on ABC television and nothing else. Nicola said she had gone in for an appointment and told the doctor that she had not felt the baby move for 24 hours. And Andrew said this: "Matilda really was a fabulous gift, not ours to hold. But whenever we're asked about our children, we'll say, yeah, we've got 4 kids, 3 on earth and 1 in heaven. They lost the station and the baby in the same year. This film is going to state that and stop, because there is no connection between those two things except a calendar, and it is not going to pretend otherwise." What came out of it, years later, was told by their daughter Grace. She said the way they lost Matilda was completely outside her parents' control, and that it drove them to ask what was inside it, what they could actually change. That became an early childhood campaign that Nicola Forrest has led for 2 decades. There is a pattern here that the legend usually leaves out. By 2001, Andrew Forrest was 40 years old, had been removed from the company he founded, had watched his family's station of 120 years sold, and had buried a daughter. Whatever came next did not come from a man who had never failed at anything, and in 2003 he bought a shell company for almost nothing. Chapter 7. $6 million. In 2003, Andrew Forrest took over a listed shell called Allied Mining and Processing and renamed it Fortescue Metals Group. By the company's own account of its founding, and it is worth labelling that, because this next stretch comes from Fortescue's corporate history, the market value of the thing was around $6 million. The plan he drew on a map of the Pilbara was a mine, a railway and a port, and he estimated it at $2 to $3 billion. $6 million of company, $3 billion of plan. What he went looking for was ore in the Chichester Range that the established companies had examined and written off as too low grade to bother with. Cloudbreak, in June 2004, then Christmas Creek. What he could not get was a railway. BHP and Rio Tinto had lines running across the Pilbara to the coast, and they were not sharing them. So Fortescue built its own, and eventually the heaviest haul railway in the world. The money came from a $2.25 billion United States dollar high-yield bond in 2006. American dollars, and say so. At the time, it was the largest issue of its kind an Australian company had ever done. First ore on ship, May 2008. And now the part of the building that does not appear in the corporate history video. And this chapter is not going to skip it. On the night of the 8th and 9th of March 2007, Cyclone George came across the coast. A Category 5, one of the most intense ever recorded in Australian waters. It struck Fortescue's railway construction camp south of Port Hedland and destroyed it. 2 Fortescue workers were killed, Deborah Till, aged 47, and Craig Raab, aged 42. 28 more were injured. The state coroner, Ross Fogliani, delivered her findings in 2015. The accommodation units at that camp, she found, had been built to a standard applicable to non-cyclonic wind areas, in a cyclonic wind region. Had they been built to the correct standard, she found, their destruction would have been avoided, and the 2 deaths prevented. The root cause was a surveyor placing the camp in the wrong wind zone. Now, the other half, and it is mandatory. Fortescue was acquitted in the Perth Magistrates Court in 2011 on the charges arising from that camp, and WorkSafe's appeal against the acquittal was dismissed by the Supreme Court of Western Australia in 2012. Both of those things are true, and this film says both. And there is one more case that has to be stated plainly, because it usually is not. The corporate regulator pursued Andrew Forrest for years over whether agreements signed with 3 Chinese state-owned entities in 2004 had been properly described to the market as binding. He won at trial. He lost on appeal. And on the 2nd of October 2012, the High Court of Australia found for him unanimously. The statements it held were neither false nor misleading. Costs were awarded against the regulator. He was comprehensively vindicated, and anybody telling you otherwise is telling you something a court has specifically rejected. And in 2009, with iron money, Andrew Forrest bought Minderoo back, about $12 million, with roughly 10,000 head of cattle on it. 11 years after his father lost it, the family had its country again. And 600 kilometres away, 4 open pits were going into somebody else's. Chapter 8. Mining Welfare. The Yindjibarndi are a Pilbara people whose country runs around the Fortescue River and the Millstream Tablelands, inland from Roebourne, a town whose name in their language is Ira Mugadu. Say who they are before you say what they sued for. Their creation time is called Ngura Njungamu, which translates as when the world was soft. Their law is carried in a song cycle. Their connection to that ground runs back tens of thousands of years, and the songs are not decoration. They are the map. They record where things are and who is responsible for them. The language has a few hundred speakers left. An organisation called Juluwalu, the word means all together, has spent a quarter of a century recording it, along with the genealogies and the country itself. Their recent history is the history of the Australian North. Pushed off the pastoral stations, moved onto a reserve at Roebourne, and when the reserve was bulldozed, elders went out and founded their own communities. And then Fortescue arrived, with the Solomon Hub. 4 open pits in the Hamersley Range. The negotiation broke down. Reported accounts put Fortescue's offer at around $4 million a year for a resource worth billions. Now the quote, and it is attributed exactly, because that is the only safe way to use it. The ABC reported that at Fortescue's annual meeting in 2019, Andrew Forrest described compensation for the Yindjibarndi as mining welfare and said Roebourne was not a community he was going to empower with tens of millions of shareholders' cash. Those are the ABC's words about what he said, and this film is not going any further than the broadcaster did. Then the community split. The Yindjibarndi Aboriginal Corporation, under its chief executive Michael Woodley, refused. A breakaway group formed and worked with Fortescue. Michael Woodley, on ABC television, put it like this: "Mining has impacted on our country very badly, I would say, the Yindjibarndi people, before we was all one, and now it has divided us." On how that split happened, use the court's own words and nothing else. A federal court judge made findings in 2015 about Fortescue's involvement in a meeting held to remove that leadership. And in 2020-26, the court said that Fortescue may have facilitated or exploited the division, but that this was not compensable. May have. That is the court's language, and this film is not going to harden it into something a judge declined to say. Here is what the courts did find, without qualification. In 2017, the federal court recognised that the Yindjibarndi held exclusive native title over about 2,700 square kilometres. In 2020, 5 judges of the full federal court upheld it unanimously. And on the 29th of May 2020, the High Court of Australia refused Fortescue's special leave to appeal, with costs. 17 years of litigation. And at the end of it, the question of who owned that ground was closed. And it is worth saying, what 17 years of litigation actually costs a people of a few hundred speakers. Legal fees they had to raise. Court appearances a continent away. Elders who gave evidence about country and did not live to hear the judgment. And before the price of it is read out, the other half of the ledger has to go on the table. Chapter 9. What the iron paid for. Before this film gets to the judgment, it has to stop and be fair, because any account of this man that leaves out what follows is not an account. It is a prosecution. Andrew and Nicola Forrest were the first Australians to sign the Giving Pledge, committing publicly to give away the majority of their wealth in their lifetimes. Then they started actually doing it. In June 2023, they transferred nearly $5 billion in Fortescue shares to their foundation in a single act. That is the largest charitable donation in Australian history, and it is not close. Before it, $400 million in 2017, which was itself the largest gift ever made by a living Australian at the time. The Foundation's endowment now runs into the billions, and it spends well over $100 million a year. On employment, the record is real, and it is unusual. Fortescue employs more than 1,600 Aboriginal people, one of the highest proportions of any large company in the country. Its training centres guarantee a job at the end of the course rather than a certificate, and on contracts. In the last financial year, Fortescue awarded more than $1 billion of work to Indigenous businesses in a single year for the first time. Since 2011, the total has passed $7.6 billion. Set those two numbers beside each other because that is the honest thing to do. $7.6 billion in contracts to Aboriginal businesses, $150 million owed to one Aboriginal nation for what was taken from it. Both of those are true. The Foundation's Walk Free arm produces the Global Slavery Index, which estimated that 50 million people were living in modern slavery on any given day in 2021. Now the counterweight, at full strength, because the ledger only works if both columns are honest. In its build-out years, Fortescue paid strikingly little company tax, $13.2 million on $9.1 billion of sales in 2014 and 2015, according to Tax Office transparency data reported at the time. The company was also paying hundreds of millions a year in state royalties in those same years, and in later profitable years, it became one of Australia's largest corporate taxpayers. All three of those statements are true simultaneously, and anybody quoting only the first one is not telling you the whole thing. Of the $70 million announced for bushfire relief in January 2020, $50 million went to a national resilience blueprint run by his own foundation rather than to frontline relief. That drew criticism at the time, and the criticism was fair. And the Green Bt, Fortescue targeted 15 million tonnes of green hydrogen a year by 2030, and then in July 2024 cut around 700 jobs and put the target on hold. Be fair about that too. The decarbonisation of the actual mining fleet is real, and it is proceeding. What was scaled back was the export vision in public, with the reasons given. Both halves of that are true, and neither cancels the other. So what is a country worth to the people who lose it? And in May 2026, a judge answered that question with a number. Chapter 10, 150 million. In May 2026, in the Federal Court in Perth, Justice Stephen Burley delivered the compensation judgment. The Yindjibarndi had asked for $1.8 billion. Fortescue argued for about $8 million. The state of Western Australia argued for less than that. What the judge found is on the record. He found the Yindjibarndi had a deep and visceral connection to that country. He found that significant damage has been done to Yindjibarndi songlines and other areas of cultural heritage. And then he counted 240 sacred sites made inaccessible, at least 124 of them completely destroyed by the operation of the mine. More than 130 square kilometres of country fenced off, because it is now too dangerous to enter. He described the grief that caused as being like the death of a child. The award was $150 million for cultural loss, plus about $100,000 for economic loss, plus interest on that. It is the largest native title compensation award in Australian history, roughly 3 times the previous record, which had itself only been set 3 months earlier. Fortescue's response, in Andrew Forrest's own written words: "We will pay the compensation tomorrow if given the opportunity." They paid, and it is not over. In late July 2026, the Yindjibarndi voted to appeal, not against the finding, but against the size of it. They argued the economic loss figure, about $100,000, does not begin to describe what was taken. Now, the arithmetic, one last time. The Solomon Hub is estimated to have generated $80 billion since it opened. Flag that figure honestly. It comes from the Yindjibarndi's own submissions to the court, and it has never been confirmed by Fortescue. But if it is anywhere near right, then $150 million is under 0.2% of what has come out of that ground. So, one last time, what is a country worth to the people who lose it? There is a mechanism underneath this whole story, and it should be said once, plainly, and without theatre. This country did not legally recognise that Aboriginal people had owned anything until 1992. Everything the Forrests took before that date was taken under a legal system that recognised no owner to take it from. The Kimberley leases that followed Alexander's report, the run on the Ashburton, the 25 million acres opened up by a survey officer who then became a land agent. That is not an accusation against one family. Every pastoral fortune in this country stands on the same ground. But it is the ground, and this family stands higher on it than almost anyone. So go and look for what is left. The statue of Alexander Forrest still stands in Stirling Gardens in Perth, holding a sextant that gets stolen periodically and replaced. The statue of Sir John stands in Kings Park, above the river. The Kimberley he opened is under native title now, most of it, determined by the same court. And the peerage was never issued. There is a man in the ground at Karrakatta who was approved as a baron by a king and never legally became one, because the paperwork did not catch the ship. On the Ashburton, Minderoo is a forest station again, lost in 1998 after 120 years, bought back in 2009 for about $12 million. The family's foundation carries its name, a Thalanagi word meaning place of permanent and clean water. So here are the two things side by side, and they are the whole film. One family lost its country and bought it back for $12 million. Another was told by a court what its country was worth, and the number was $150 million, and there is nothing to buy back with it. The sites are gone. The songs went through them. The Forrests got their country back. Nobody can give the Yindjibarndi theirs.